Awayithandi awayifuni
NUMSA yo NUMSA
ayiwafuna
NUMSA
Good day and welcome to another episode of Workers' Power. Well, ladies and gentlemen, today we have a real treat for you. We have one of my favorite economists, Mr. Duma Gqubule, in the studio to unpack for us some of the things that I know NUMSA members and of course other members of the working class are very, very concerned about. And that is the South African economy and this issue of austerity. Austerity is a word, we hear about it all the time. We know that it's bad for us, but do we really know what austerity is? Mr. Gqubule, thank you so much for coming to our studio. I'm so pleased.
Thank you so much, man. It's an honor, yeah.
So, Duma, let's get straight into it. What exactly is austerity and how has it been applied to South Africa? Okay,
so austerity is where the government cuts spending to supposedly reduce the budget deficit and the debt ratio of the country. So it has been applied. I've looked at the economy over the last 27 years. From the time we had our GEAR policy, we had an austerity program under GEAR. And then the austerity stopped around 2002. And we had an expansionary monetary and fiscal policy. But what's happened, the current crisis, is that from 2009 to 2022, the government has stopped spending on its people and its infrastructure. So what I'm telling South Africans is that you have to understand that the performance of the economy over the last 27 years, since 1994, 29 years, it correlates with roughly with the level of government spending. So when the government spends on its people and its infrastructure, the economy grows and it creates jobs. So what I was saying is that, so what we're doing now is that what happened since the global financial crisis is that the government stopped spending on its people and its infrastructure. So that in a nutshell is what austerity is, yeah. And what we say is that it's a very self-defeating strategy. I say it's a daft idea that makes no sense. It just makes no sense whatsoever because the debt ratio, the debt to GDP or the budget deficit to the GDP, it's influenced by the bottom part of that equation. So what we're seeing in South Africa is that because you're cutting government spending, government is about 40% of the economy broadly defined. If you say central consolidated government and the state-owned companies and so forth. So if you're cutting spending on 40% of the economy, that will trigger a decline in GDP and that results in a higher debt ratio. So what we're seeing in South Africa now is that our increasing debt ratio since 2009 is not because we are overspending, it's because we're spending too little. Yeah.
So on that note, because one of the things I also want us to talk about is the concept of neoliberalism and neoliberal economics. Which in some ways I think austerity plays into that.
Yes.
And we can agree that what the South African government has been implementing, certainly, since they've been in power, has been neoliberal economics. So if you can sort of broadly explain that to our viewers, what is that and how does that affect us also?
So I have a definition I always write about, but I forget it. Yeah. So, but basically it's about, they talk about these structural reforms. It's about, so there's two ways we can grow the economy. Number one is by growing demand in the economy. But they say, no, we can't do that. We don't have the money. So we must grow through these structural reforms, the structural neoliberal reforms. It's about the withdrawal of the state from what they call network industries, electricity, water, so forth. And, you facilitate the entry onto the private sector into those industries. So it's about increasing private sector involvement in key strategic industries. Privatization based. It's privatization, liberalization, and deregulation of the economy. Those three go together. That is what austerity is. And I think as a working class, we should fight for the defense of certain key industries. Number one, education. Number two, we're seeing austerity creeping into education. Number two is healthcare. This is why we need a national health service. I don't believe in a national health insurance. I believe in a national health service.
What is the difference
So a
national health service and national health insurance?
So national health insurance is where the medical aids continue to provide services. I believe that this must be a totally state-driven industry. I don't think that education and health, there should be a role for the private sector, except at the extremes. Like really, like, I don't know.
For the 1%.
Yeah, for the 1%, like plastic surgery. But for most of us, 99% of us, I don't believe there should be any private sector. So I wouldn't want a discovery to exist in the future. That's what I believe in. So that number, education, health. I'm a big believer in free tertiary education, free basic and tertiary education, and then healthcare, energy, electricity. I don't believe that it's a neoliberal reforms that we're having in our energy sector, whereby the state is now refusing to invest in the energy infrastructure, the electricity infrastructure, and they're opening it out for the private sector to provide electricity. It sounds good, but it's technically, so I believe that it should be entirely publicly owned. Yeah. So we should take profit out of education, health, also in terms of electricity and public, and we need to have public subsidized, massively subsidized passenger transport and mass housing. We're talking about housing earlier on. Just before we came into this. And I do believe that we should, those are the five that I think as a working class, we should try to protect the encroachment of the private sector in those things, because this is your spending basket as a working class people. When I went to, went to my home in the Eastern Cape, I noticed that, people, these are workers. I remember once there was a public sector strike, when my mother passed away, and everybody wasn't working. They were coming to help in the house. And I was to ask myself, why are they here? No, they're on strike, And so I realized that people have to pay for stuff that they shouldn't have to pay for. Public sector workers, they shouldn't be able to pay for education. They shouldn't pay for health. They shouldn't be paying for, they should be subsidized electricity pricing and subsidized transport. So in South Africa, so there's a basket of services that should be publicly provided, to reduce the cost of living for ordinary working class people. Yeah.
So I could just hear the right wingers.
Yeah.
breaking out into hives.
Yeah. Yes, of course. Yeah.
Because honestly, many people are just like, where's the money going to come from? We can't afford it. How do you respond to those who say that? Okay, so what I say is that, first of all, we have a central bank. We need a develop. So the problem in South Africa right now is that we have this national development plan. It's got certain macroeconomic targets like GDP growth of 5% and creation of 11 million jobs. But the problem is nobody is responsible for achieving those targets. So what you have is that the Reserve Bank only cares about inflation. The Treasury only cares about debt. So what we should do, we should flip that script and we should set a non-negotiable GDP growth target of 6%. That's what I believe, yeah. So in practice, what it means is that we are going to grow, I don't know, next year, maybe 1.5%. So the government must step in and put in the difference between the 1.5 and the 6%. That's how the Asian countries grow. They have a 20-year, 30-year national vision, 5-year plans and annual targets, That's how they operate, all of them, the developmental states, yeah. So where the money is going to come from, number one, we have a central bank in South Africa. The central bank can finance economic development. That is called monetary financing. So throughout the 20th century, central banks were agents of economic development until the neoliberal era from the late 70s to the 80s. Yeah, they financed wars, they financed government spending. So what happened is that during the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008, they started, I'm talking about the Western central banks, they started, participating in the economy, financing government spending. And in the COVID response, it was the separation between monetary and fiscal policy just disappeared. So we had a global stimulus response of about $17 trillion. 75% of that was financed by central banks. In the US, the biggest stimulus of all of them, 50% was financed by the US Fed. In the UK, $350 billion was the stimulus response to COVID. 98% was financed by the Bank of England, And in the Eurozone, their response,
83% was financed by the European Central Bank. So central banks throughout the world are involved in terms of spending money, and this artificial separation of monetary and fiscal policy has disappeared in the advanced economy. So that's number one.
So why can't our central bank fund us?
Yes, they can. So the central bank, it's called monetary financing, can finance development. Number two, the central bank can provide financing to the government on favorable terms. I'm talking about, at the repo rate,
Right.
and they can offer extended payment terms to the government in terms of, and they can finance development finance institutions. They can finance, government agencies and so forth. That's number two. Number three, so the central bank also can do what is called quantitative easing. They can, in most of the advanced economies, the central banks have nationalized what is called the bond market, where the government raises capital. And the reason for them to do that is to reduce the cost of capital for the government. Mm-hmm. So when there's coordination between monetary and fiscal policy, where they're buying government bonds, they're basically they're fighting against the speculators on the bond market, and they're saying, we will target that interest rate. Japan is doing it as we speak. They intervene in the market. They own 50% of their bond market, government bond market in Japan. So what they're doing, so many countries, what we believe is that the cost of government debt is a policy variable that the government can control if there was a. So what we need to do is to reduce the cost of government borrowing as well. So that's number three. Number four, we have a vast public sector balance sheet. That's what I talk about. Number two, the easier part of it, if you look at the budget, the Reserve Bank, the government's got cash of 226 billion, number one. Number two, during COVID, the government ran down the surplus in the... So we've got the Public Investment Corporation, which is 2.6 trillion assets. We've got foreign exchange reserves, about 1.1 trillion. Mm-hmm. And then we've got cash of about 226 billion. So that's about 3.9 trillion, which is our national balance sheet, the SA Inc. balance sheet. So starting at the bottom, I said that we have cash. And then the Public Investment Corporation is the asset manager of the UIF and the Government Employees Pension Fund. So what happened with the government, the UIF, during COVID, the government created money out of thin air, 60 billion rand. They paid to 13 million people who were temporarily unemployed during COVID. They ran down that surplus. But now there's still a surplus of 110 billion rands in that, So that's number two. Number three, the Government Employees Pension Fund. How can I explain this? There's a private sector pension fund must be fully funded because it can go bust, So, but there's no scenario where the government will go bust, where the government can't.
They can guarantee.
They can, what they owe the pensioners. Yeah. So throughout the world, like the rich countries and the OECD countries, most of these public sector pension funds operate on a pay-as-you-go basis, or they are partially funded. The largest one in the US, their one, is partially funded. So what I'm trying to say is that we have got 110% funding in our Government Employees Pension Fund. Number one, that is 400 billion rands above the target set by the trustees of 90%. And number two, this fund has been accumulating surpluses of 525 billion rands. In the 10 years until last year. And so they're accumulating these surpluses at 50 billion rands a year. So what I'm saying is that we had to do a one-off restructuring of balance sheet. We can reduce the funding to 50% and we can release 1.3 trillion rands into the economy through that. It would involve quite a large decrease in government debt, which is about the PIC 800 billion rands of government debt that they own. So they could write it off, I say, and then invest the rest in the economy. So it would reduce. So I'm just talking about a one-off restructuring of our balance sheet as a country to facilitate this massive development, that we need to do as a country. Yes. So those are the two ones. And then, and number three, our debt is not high by international standards. I don't know where people get this from. It's 70% debt to GDP ratio. During COVID, every single country debt ratio went up. It's like in the school ground, all the kids were naughty, and you can't punish one kid. So you see what I'm saying? Like everybody in the world,
everybody's doing it.
Yeah, everybody's doing the
so
same.
why
yeah.
are we?
And then even in our emerging market peers, our BRICS countries, we've got a low. It's not high even when you benchmark it against the big BRICS countries. So I don't know where this propaganda comes from that the government debt is high. And then it started off during GEAR years. We believed that there was an apartheid debt, that the debt was high.
Yes, I remember that.
Yes, but the point, that's what justified the GEAR program, which was a disaster. So what I'm saying is that the GEAR program, the debt to GDP ratio was 50% at the time. It was far lower than it is now, far lower than the rest of the world. But somehow we were panicked into doing this unnecessary cost-cutting austerity program. So what I'm trying to say is that there's so many ways creatively that we can raise the money for the stimulus that I'm talking about here. Yeah.
So I want us to go back to, because you were explaining how austerity can affect, for example, you were saying that the government should play a more constructive role by intervening directly in the economy and ensuring that things like, for example, when it comes to healthcare and education, there should be no private sector involvement, right? No, so I wanted to talk about how does austerity affect things like the price of food?
Yes.
How does it affect healthcare and education and government's ability to deliver on those things for
so austerity, I was reading a study by this WITS, one of the centers at WITS. It has reduced the pay of people who work in the public sector, For example, nurses, it has reduced doctors, also educators as well. So there's also been restructuring, so the per capita expenditure has declined over the past 10 years. So what you've seen is declining services in education and health. These are constitutional inquiries. So it is very damaging to our economy. And you have to remember that for us to reach OECD standards in terms of nurses to population and doctors to population, I've calculated we need to employ about 300,000 nurses and about just under 200,000, about 180,000 doctors. So we have got a shortage of workers in our public sector. And number two, I strongly believe that we have to equalize these two education systems. So in the public sector, the education must be the same as in the private sector. And over time, there shouldn't be a need to send your children to a private school. So if we have the certain learner educator ratios as in the private sector and international benchmarks, we would have to employ 400,000 teachers, So I honestly believe that it's such a scale of, because we're not producing that, it's something that we should be prepared to import teachers in the meantime, but it is so. And also train them, educators in our country. So those are the kind of challenges that we're having in our country right now. So austerity is saying that, and as you see, the biggest cost of austerity is the declining infrastructure in our country. From 2015 to 2022, the government has just point blank refused to invest in infrastructure. Public investment has declined by 38% in real terms, and I can't understand the logic. And if you look at the requirements in terms of going forward to 2030, we need water infrastructure. I saw the figure. It's about 1 trillion rands, and they're refusing. They say, no, must find a way to do the private sector.
How are you going to do it?
That's what I'm trying to say. And then number two, you've seen the firing of the people at Transnet, But the point is, at the end of the day, the government must build the rail infrastructure. So there's this assumption by National Treasury that Eskom, Transnet, and local government, we're in the center of Johannesburg today, can self-finance their way to solve their issues. But if you look at, let's take City of Joburg, for example, the infrastructure backlog is 300 billion. The spending per year is about 7 billion. So this is just Joburg. And if you do that nationally, municipalities don't raise enough money from us to be able to solve these massive infrastructure backlogs that you've seen, the buildings that are collapsing in the city of Joburg and so forth.
So government actually has to give them money. They have to.
Yeah, they have to. Yeah, they have to. So
you have to spend the money.
And it's the thing I can't understand about not spending on infrastructure is that IMF the Bible of, the people who the National Treasury worships, they say infrastructure spending has got a multiplier effect that is very high, of 2.7 in developing countries. It's higher than in rich countries. So if you spend R1 billion, 2.7 billion rands comes back to the government, and it grows the economy and it creates jobs. And that's what happened between 2003 and 2008 when we started spending on infrastructure. So I just don't understand this. The government is just refusing to, like, for example, the electricity grid. They need to spend, I think, 250 billion rands, but they're saying they don't have money. So why would you not want to spend on your electricity grid? It makes no sense because it creates jobs. So when we're talking about what we should spend...
And it's literally the engine that drives the economy.
Yes.
No electricity, there's no...
You were in China recently. If you've been there, you see they spend on infrastructure like it's going crazy. Like they're in a situation where there's excess infrastructure in China right now, it's like... There's many people there, I've been there and studied tours twice, And then, but I'm just saying they get it, that, infrastructure creates the resources to more than pay for itself. So I really do not understand why we as a country are just refusing point blank to spend on infrastructure when it's such a quick win for a country. Yeah.
It's interesting that you're saying that because it's almost as if... we were using this analogy earlier. It's like planting a seed.
Yes.
And then you somehow miraculously expect the plant to grow, but you're not pouring the water.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's a very good one. So now just as we head towards the end, I've been talking to a lot of leaders in South Africa, about what we should do to get our economy growing. So, so number one, it's like 7 pillars of what we need to do to get a country growing. Number one, I think we need this non-negotiable economic growth target of 6%, a mobilizing vision and plan for our economy, and it will double the size of economy every 12 years, That's number one. Number two, I'm a strong believer in the basic income grant, implemented at the 3 poverty lines over 3 years. It provides a strong stimulus to the economy. So we would blend consumption and investment. So the basic income grant is number 2. Number 3, we've got these public employment programs. You've got the expanded public works, you've got the community works program, and you've got the presidential employment stimulus. I say we should amalgamate these programs. They spend about 18 billion rands a year, and we should provide a job guarantee to South Africans over time. So what we should do is to increase the budget towards public employment. It should increase many times. So we now provide about 2 million work opportunities, about 900,000. It's about 1.8 million work opportunities and 900,000 full-time equivalent jobs. So we should increase that over time to 3 to 4 to 5 million rands public employment. Number 3, we should obviously, as I was saying, invest in infrastructure. The target in the NDP, which we all believe in, is that there should be 30% GDP total investment to GDP. So it requires a public sector investment to GDP target of about 10%. So the shortfall to achieve that is about 400 billion rands a year. To achieve the total investment target is about 1 trillion rands a year. So this gives you an idea of the scale of the infrastructure that we have to be spending here. So, and then, as I said, we have to do universal public services, education, health, subsidized electricity, and transport and mass housing. And I believe that the central bank, the government must take over housing below 1 million rands and provide affordable housing financed by a state bank. I saw this in Australia. The Green Party was proposing something similar, and I thought it was really good. So it should do things like taxis and for public transport. And because, taxes pay 27% interest. It's like ludicrous. So I believe that we have to, change the whole fleet, the whole fleet, and provide subsidies to them, regulate the entire industry, and so public housing, public transport, passenger, taxis, passenger trains, and so forth, and that's what's going to get our economy growing again as well, and we should for long haul start considering things like high-speed rail. I'm sure you've traveled in China on the bullet train, yes. So I'm just those type of things. So those are the things that we should be following. And then finally, regional integration. I was rereading the RDP recently, the last few days, and it was such an inspiring document. And they were saying that, we have to have balanced development. Migration at the end of the day is about balanced development in the region. And they were saying that we have to have balanced development within South Africa. So we should stop the flow of people towards the major metropolitan areas and decentralize development throughout the country.
Which would mean developing the rural areas.
Yes, that's what they said in the RDP, but they said at the same time, we must develop the country, help develop the region so that we don't have the same flow of people, from
different parts of
the region. So it's about balanced development in a region. That's what they said, and they pointed out that we must change the exploitative relationships between us and our trading partners. So they pointed out that their imports from us is like what they import from us is 5 times more than what they export to us. So we've got this massive trade surplus with the region. It's massive. It's huge. I looked for it recently. So they were saying that we must restructure our relationship with the neighbors. So now back to this issue on regional engagement. I've done a lot of research on migration in South Africa. And at the age of 11, I went to school in Eswatini. Okay. So I've always considered myself to be an African first before I'm anything else, So just a summary of what I believe, So in terms of Southern Africa, I believe that the South African Customs Union must become a common market with free movement of labor. So the border with Lesotho makes no sense whatsoever.
We should just be able to
move between, because
capital moves freely anyway.
Yes, because Basotho have been here since the early 19th century, since the mid 19th century. So there's no point in that border. Number 2 is the Mozambique. So it must be one market. And then the second thing is that if you look at our migrants, 2/3 of them come from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, And so
from the SADC region.
From the SADC region. So it's about unbalanced. It's about unbalanced development. And so I'm just saying that what we need to do now is that I believe that Zimbabwe and Mozambique must become part of the common market in Southern Africa. It would create a bigger common market. And Mozambique, Ruth First, I've been reading her archive recently. She explains how Mozambicans came to the country, to the sugarcane first, in the 1840s and 50s, to the Kimberley diamond mines, and she writes extensively about it, and to build our gold industry later. And by 1906, 2/3 of the workers on our gold mines were from Mozambique. Sure. Fast forward to 1997, 57% of people working in our mining industry were from the region. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to create balanced development within our region. That's what I believe, and create a big common market in our region. That's what I believe, and accelerate the integration of SADC as well.
I think that would be a really fascinating topic to unpack, especially because, we do have this problem, unfortunately, of suspicion and xenophobia in relation to, people from outside of South Africa. And I think there was something very interesting that you tweeted once where you said something like, even if you were to deport every single foreign national, we would still have an unemployment crisis in South Africa. And that's because people don't understand that the unemployment crisis is actually not really related to the existence of foreign nationals.
Okay, so
maybe you can
let me explain. So I looked at the numbers, 96 to 2001. Nothing happened in terms of migration in South Africa, So it was about, I can't remember, 2.9% of the population, somewhere there, So now the collapse of the Zimbabwean economy. So that is what the biggest driver of because I've said Lesotho people, so the 2/3 of our migrants are from 3 countries, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Lesotho. So Mozambique and Lesotho have always been in South Africa. They've always been going up and throughout the country depending on the economy. And then, so it's all that changed is that the Zimbabwean economy collapsed. So that becomes our problem. Do you see what I'm saying? Yes. So that's why I'm saying that, I don't know, like I've been to Zimbabwe more times than Cape Town. I understand that country. So what I'm trying to say is that now we need to bring them, like if we send everyone, let's just remember what happened in Zimbabwe. There was the land reform program that was botched, whatever reason. And how can I put it? And then it resulted in a collapse of the economy. In fact, the economy had started collapsing during the Mugabe era, like there was the structural reform in the early 90s.
Let's not forget the sanctions.
Yeah, the sanctions as well. But it started off in 1992 with the structural adjustment that was implemented by Mugabe himself, you know. And then the IMF programs that he implemented until the late 80s, that is what caused the collapse of the Zimbabwean economy. So by the time you have what happened now, in the early 2000s, it was on top of an economy that is collapsing, you know, because I've been to Zimbabwe many times, you know, I understand that economy very well. So what I'm trying to say is that the Zimbabwean economy, so that's basically what I'm saying. So we have to rebuild that economy as South Africans, and we have to do whatever it takes. And I argue with Zimbabweans that you have to have your own currency. You can't be pegging your currency against the dollar or the rand or whatever. And so we have to rebuild that economy.
But also, I think the main
So my message is that if you send, so according to my calculation, there's 4 million migrants in South Africa, 6% of the population, 6.6. So I try to talk to the Department of Home Affairs, they don't have the stats, you know. I assume that there's about 3 million irregular migrants, you know. So if you send them home, it's going to result in a collapse of the SADC economy that will make what happened, the collapse of the Zimbabwean economy, like a picnic, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. It will be far more in terms of the repercussions on the region than what happened in the Zimbabwean economy. So it's a dangerous proposal that people don't understand the implications of it. It would cause chaos in our region that is far worse than the chaos that we've seen so far. Yeah.
I think we need to talk more about that. But I think also one of the things we must also emphasize is that part of where we are in terms of unemployment is by design.
Yes, it's a policy choice.
It's a policy choice. We could fix this.
We could fix it. Okay.
For example, if we stopped privatizing state-owned entities.
Yes. And we started investing in our country. So now, just
investment in infrastructure, absorption of doctors. For example, there's doctors sitting at home when we've got shortages of doctors in our hospitals. The one
that I've spoken to South African Institute of Chartered Accountants, you know, during the budget, they usually invite me to talk. And you get women, people calling me that they're unemployed. African women, chartered accountants.
Do you see what I'm saying? This is
heartbreaking. Yes.
You know, and this is why you cannot actually, you know, sort of summarize our problems and say it's because of foreign nationals.
Yes.
Cannot be. But let's get back to austerity while we have a minute left on this show.
Yeah.
And because the one thing that I wanted, us to also talk about, and from your perspective as an economist, and I like your 7 pillars, but perhaps you can summarize for us. What, in your view, because you've already said that neoliberalism, total failure, austerity is not going to help us. What, in your view, is the best alternative system which will take care of the majority of people and ensure that we are actually able to effectively tackle poverty, unemployment, and inequality?
You know, we had a discussion once, you know, with Alex from the South African Communist Party. We live not far from each other, you know. And so I was saying, like, Alex, what does socialism mean for you, you know? So, and let's just debate it. And so we agreed, those things I was telling you earlier. For me, it has to start with reclaiming education, reclaiming healthcare, providing it to the people, having subsidized, deeply subsidized, because I didn't even talk about what we need to do for the electricity prices. You know, the free basic electricity is too little. It's about 300. We shouldn't do more because like middle class households can't afford this electricity. So in addition to the spending that we have to do to fix our grid, you know, fix our generation capacity, we have to provide more subsidies to ordinary households, far in excess of what we're providing now. And number 3, I talked about public transport. We need to have subsidized public transport. In a previous life, I was an advisor to the Department of Transport, and I've witnessed the whole situation around the taxi industry and public transport. And quite frankly, we need to regulate the entire industry, take it over, and provide subsidies for people to be able to travel throughout in the metropolitan and between the country,
So greater intervention above the state.
Yes, and also public housing as well, and public housing. So for me, we should just protect, in terms of socialism, those are the areas where I believe that we should start building towards the socialist future in South Africa,
Duma, thank you so much for your time. And that's another episode of Workers' Power. We want to thank you so much again for joining us as we unpack the economy and we deepen our understanding of austerity and how it affects the working class. Thank you so much, Duma, for spending your time with us. That was truly enlightening. And I know we're going to see you again to talk more about some of the very interesting issues that you've raised. And of course, to our viewers out there, like, subscribe to this channel. Give us your comments about what you think or about some of the things that we've spoken about. And of course, we look forward to hearing from you about future suggestions for the show. So that's it. Another episode of Workers' Power. I'll see you again next time.